There was a pretty big thunderstorm going on this night. Nothing dangerous or anything, but enough to keep everyone inside for the rest of the day. I'm one of those people that enjoy rainy nights. Or even storms. Something about it just makes me feel cozy and relaxed. Whenever there was a night like this, I'd always spend the night on the couch watching TV and listening to the rain. Luckily, I didn't have work the next day, and although it was already 8 p.m., I decided to make a hot cup of coffee and stay up as late as I could to enjoy the cozy night. I sat down and turned on a movie. It was only 20 minutes into the movie when my phone started ringing. I picked it up and looked at the number, but didn't recognize it. However, the area code was from this city. I answered just in case, always worried it might be something important, or someone I knew, but just didn't have their number saved. Hello. No one said anything. Can I help you? Hello. Still, no one spoke. Oddly, I could tell it wasn't a dead line, though. Like I could hear background noise. It was messy. And after thinking about it for a couple seconds, it kind of sounded like the storm or rain outside. So, I knew someone was there. But they just weren't talking. Feeling weird, I hung up. I couldn't really think of any reason someone would call and say nothing. I figured it had to be a mistake, or a scam of some kind, even though it wasn't the typical robot voice or whatever. I tossed my phone back on the end table and continued watching TV. I got pretty well into the movie, probably an hour through, when in just a matter of seconds, the storm outside got increasingly louder. It really picked up thunder, lightning, and heavy rain. Then the TV and lights flickered. They quickly turned off, then right back on in a split second. I paused the movie and looked around, not sure what was happening. Then, not even 30 seconds later, the power went out. Suddenly, the entire house was silent, and the storm was twice as loud. Rain was flooding onto the roof and against the windows, and there was heavy non-stop thunder for what felt like 5 whole minutes. The only light I had was a small candle that I basically never used. Obviously, I had my phone too, but I didn't want to waste its battery, especially since I didn't know how long this would last for. I lit the candle, then figured I'd just double-check the breaker box downstairs. I went down and saw the switch was loose. I flipped it back and forth, but it was completely dead. I went back upstairs and really had nothing to do but watch the storm out the window. I also noticed all the other houses down the entire street were dark as well, so it looked like it was a pretty bad power outage. My phone was running off of 5G data, so I checked if there was any information on the status. But there was nothing. I was probably standing there by the window for about 15 minutes watching and listening to the storm when completely out of nowhere, I heard something from outside the house. I immediately recognized the sound. It was the gate to my backyard swinging open. That gate didn't have any sort of lock on it, but it never just swings open like that. Really not having any ideas what it could have been, I walked to the back of the house and looked out the back door. Even through the darkness and the storm and everything, I could see the shadow of a man. They had clearly just come from the side the gate was on, but he was just standing in the rain in the middle of the backyard. Because I could really only see his outline, he just looked like a dark figure. I couldn't tell where he was looking. Was he looking toward the house at me? Or was he facing away from the house? I didn't know what he was doing out there, but it gave me a bad feeling. I know I could have opened the door and yelled at him to leave my property, but I felt kind of nervous. I mean, if he was crazy enough to just be walking around outside in the middle of a massive storm like this, it wouldn't be far off to assume that he had a gun or something. I thought it was best to not confront them. So, I just stayed by the door and watched him. They didn't move for an entire minute. Until his arm slowly lifted up from his pocket. And he put his hand by his head. I didn't know what he was doing. But I could see a small glowing light in his hand. And just when I realized what it was, my phone began ringing in the other room. It didn't take me all but 2 seconds to understand what was going on. This random guy outside my house was calling me. That's why I could hear the rain on the other end of the phone earlier when he wasn't saying anything. But that was an hour ago. Had he been out in the storm standing outside my home the whole time? Freaking out, I hurried into the living room and grabbed my phone, confirming it was the same number. Then, without answering it, I went back to the door. The man was gone. This freaked me out. Why didn't I just stay by the door and keep an eye on him? I felt stupid. I didn't like standing by the door, though, knowing he might be somewhere out there watching me while I couldn't see him. I went back to the living room. I thought about calling the cops, but I really didn't know what to say. Like, someone called me twice and was outside my home, but I had no proof it was the same person, or that they were doing anything wrong aside from being in my backyard. Not too long later, my phone rang again. It made me jump even though I was half expecting it. That's how freaked out I was. I declined the call and only seconds later, a loud knock came from the front door. They called again while continuing to knock on the door. These were heavy hits, too, shaking the walls of the house. I turned my phone on silent and embarrassingly, I kind of froze up and did nothing. I know how dumb that sounds, but I've never been in a situation like that before. And when you add in the storm and the power outage, it just made it all worse. I think it took 30 seconds. And for them to begin hitting the door even more aggressively before I finally snapped out of it and called the police. My hands were shaking as I held the phone. They said an officer was heading over right away, and they were about 4 minutes from me. I continued to inform them of what I knew, and the man didn't let off hitting the door. This went on for the entire time that I was waiting for the cop to arrive. Finally, the operator said that they were on my street. A few moments later, I heard someone yelling. I hurried up to the window and just caught sight of the officer chasing him. They ran off into the storm, and I couldn't see anything after that. I think I waited 2 minutes before the officer came back empty-handed. The guy was able to get away. I was actually impressed by how much the police department tried to help me, though. They did a pretty thorough investigation and seemed to take it seriously. Probably because they actually saw and chased the guy. But the only real lead was the phone number, and it ended up being a dead end. I tried coming up with anyone who would be out to get me like this, but I had no idea. The case kind of died out, and since then, I've never gotten any calls from that number or seen anything else. I don't remember exactly what year it was that this happened, but I've never really been able to shake the horror I felt that night. It's one of those things you assume would never happen to you, or that only happens in the movies. But being that naive only makes it 100 times more terrifying. If you are unfortunate enough to experience something similar. I was young at the time, being in middle school, kind of at that age where I was starting to feel like I was growing up a bit, you know, feeling more like a man, I guess, which is silly to think about looking back. Anyway, it was summer, so most of my days were spent hanging out with my friends, either outside or gaming inside. This weekend was special though. My parents were taking a short road trip to a city 8 hours away to relive their honeymoon, or something like that. I didn't care too much about the details. because all I could think about was how excited I was to have the house to myself, and invite my friends to sleep over, with no rules to follow or anything. They left early Saturday morning. So, when I woke up, they were already gone. I immediately texted my best friend Finn. The only issue was that his parents definitely wouldn't let him over, if they knew that there were no adults in the house. But with a little bit of lying, Finn was allowed to come over. Now, he wasn't going to be at my place until later in the day, like 6-ish. But being excited, I opened up the front windows, so I could see when he got here later. However, when I did, I quickly noticed a man outside. The only reason I even cared was because he was strangely close to the house, like past the sidewalk and kind of near the garage. He had a very distinct look to him. Longish dark hair, patchy beard, and fairly tall and skinny. It made me feel uneasy. So I moved away from the window, not wanting to get spotted looking at him. A few minutes later, I quickly checked again, and he was gone. I didn't think it was anything worth mentioning. The rest of that day was chill. I was mostly in my room just playing on my Xbox until 6 o'clock. When Finn finally made it, we grabbed some snacks from the kitchen, then went upstairs, and pretty much locked ourselves in my room, and played video games for 5 hours straight. It was about 11:30, and of course we were still playing Xbox when Finn left the room to go to the bathroom. Only 30 seconds later though, he came back and asked if I heard that. I asked what, not having heard anything. But before Finn could answer, the whole house suddenly went dark. The TV, Xbox, lights, everything just shut off. I couldn't even see Finn standing in the doorway 5 feet from me. I combed the floor with my hands, trying to feel around for my phone. Picking it up and turning on the flashlight, both me and Finn were quiet for a second. I think just confused why the power had shut off so suddenly. But also I was listening for what sound Finn said. He heard just a few moments before the blackout. Eventually, after hearing nothing, and the power not coming back on, I asked again what he heard. But Finn said he wasn't really sure. Maybe like a thump, or a footstep on the floor below us. With the power shutting off though, we assumed it was probably just something to do with that. But we still didn't know why it shut off. And being younger and alone in the house, it was still a little unsettling, knowing we kind of had to figure out what was going on. We went out into the hallway, and down to the first floor. Once we left the room, we noticed we could hear the wind outside. It wasn't anything out of the usual, but enough to maybe consider that it could have caused a problem. Maybe it was us just grasping for something to blame, though. Neither of us really knew what to do in this situation. Like, I knew there was an electrical box in the basement that could somehow test or turn the power back on. But I didn't know any specifics, and I was kind of nervous to try anything. Finn thought he might be able to figure it out, though, so I showed him to the basement. Oddly, the door was already open. Rarely does anyone go down there, because it was unfinished and nothing was there, but some storage and random old unused stuff. However, with my parents going on a trip, I thought maybe they might have gone down to grab some suitcases or something. The basement door was kind of toward the back of the house, so I hadn't been over there that whole day. This just made the whole thing a bit more unsettling than it already was. We still had our phone flashlights on, so Finn led the way as we walked down the creaky wooden stairs and into the basement. It wasn't very big, kind of like a wide corridor with concrete walls, and a few boxes and loose items stacked up along the wall. Obviously, it was extremely dark. Anything that wasn't directly in front of our flashlights was completely pitch black. We went over to the electrical box. The panel that covered it was already partially opened. Finn looked around at it. But I think now that he was down here, he was also just as nervous as I was about trying anything. The main larger switch was the only one that was flipped to the opposite side from all the rest, though. Of course, we didn't know what this meant. But after a bit of hesitation, he flipped it over. Immediately, there were a bunch of faint beeping sounds and random startup noises from all the appliances on the floor above us. The basement was still completely dark, though, as we never even tried turning the lights on. Before going down there was only a single sliver of light shining down the staircase from the first floor. We started walking back down the corridor to get to the stairs. But just before we got there, a sudden shuffling sound came from the other side of the basement. Both of us stopped moving, and I shined my light in that direction. In the dark, someone was standing there. I could see their shape outlined in the light, and I immediately recognized their tall, skinny appearance and long dark hair. He was standing sort of behind some boxes, which casted a shadow over his face. So I couldn't tell if we were making eye contact or not, or if he was sure that we saw him. I turned and booked it up the stairs. Finn followed close behind. I slammed the door behind us, and we just ran right out the front door. Both of us were understandably freaking out. We ran across the street, and I started a call with 911. It was pretty clear as we stood there, and all the other houses' lights were on, that the man in the basement had shut off the power. While on the phone getting updates from the operator, we saw a figure move past one of the downstairs windows. Then 15 seconds later, they moved past an upstairs window. I think it was the one to my parents' room that they were walking around in. But for the next couple minutes, we saw nothing else before police arrived. They went in and nobody was there. He'd already left out one of the back windows. Of course, my parents were called, and there were a ton of questions. But ultimately nothing came of it. There's so many horrifying things to think about when it comes to what happened that night, or could have happened, like how long that man had been watching the house for, or watching my family for. What exactly was he trying to do by breaking in and shutting off the power, then staying hidden in the basement? Thankfully, my parents were smart enough to move us out of that house soon after. Hopefully, we never have any more encounters with that man again.